This is Kai Bird off camera, interviewing Charles Oppenheimer and Dorothy Vanderford. And just for the record, I'll ask you to state your names and your date of birth and where you were born.
Okay. My name is Dorothy Vanderford, and I was born as Dorothy Oppenheimer, August 18th, 1973. I was born in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Charlie?
My name's Charles Oppenheimer. I was born on April 20th, 1975 in a small adobe house in Arroyo, Ocona, New Mexico, but I usually simplify that to Santa Fe.
Santa Fe.
It's maybe 15 miles near Santa Fe. I was born at home.
So I'm trying to remember now, but when I was researching with Marty Sherwin our biography of Oppenheimer, I came and I at some point talked to you, and I interviewed your father in Santa Fe. And I can't remember, did I interview you or not? Maybe not.
I am not having a clearer memory of it, but I did start getting emails from you, and that's where I made that connection that maybe we had met, but unfortunately I cannot remember.
And then I was just telling you, I had this vivid memory of coming to interview your father, and then afterwards he took me up to a house in Santa Fe where Ella was staying. I think she was working in a Starbucks at the time.
Yeah, that would be her.
And we spent a couple of hours going over family photograghs from the albums and such.
I think I know where my confusion came from.
Yeah.
It's because I'd had that box of photos at my home in Boulder City.
Yeah, I think the box had to come.
And he and Ella showed up, and so I just maybe invented you also visiting us. Creative.
You see, this is the problem for historians and with oral histories. Human memory is really fuzzy.
Yes, you get a different perspective every time.
You have these sharp memories of what happened, and yet they conflate with things over time. And anyway, so let's stick with you. I guess I'd like to begin with asking. I know from interviewing other people for other biographies that growing up as the son or daughter of, or grandson or granddaughter of a famous person can be, there can be some pluses to it, but it can also be baggage. It can be a burden. So when did you first realize as a child that there was something special about your grandfather, who, of course, you'd never met, had you?
Neither of us.
And so, what was that earliest memory?
Yeah, it's funny because I actually wrote that down as somewhat as the subject of my few words I was going to talk about today. So I remember pretty clearly going up and down to our ranch in New Mexico. For some reason, I remember being in the car, the trees, the bend of the road when we were talking about this. It's one of those memory things. Maybe it didn't happen there, but that's what I remember.
The memories are important to get down, whatever they are.
Of having a conversation in our Jeep truck and asking. I can't put the time on it. We lived there in two periods up at the ranch. When I was younger, before 5, almost exclusively, and later when I was about 8. And so it was likely from the later time, and maybe I'd heard something. I was asking my dad, and the conversation I remember was specifically with my dad saying, your grandfather was somebody who worked on a big project during the war, and he kind of got picked out. He was going to do something to help, and he ended up being picked out for this big project. He might have done anything during the war, but he happened to work on the scientific project. And that kind of statement of he's just kind of contributing to a war effort, and he was one of the people who contributed, was my first kind of family framing of it. There's a couple other random memories I have, and I'm not sure about Dorothy, at a birthday party at the Freemans, and I was running along, and a boy picked up a piece of obsidian and said, this is an atomic bomb that's going to blow up, and you know what that is. And I said, I do? I don't know what that is. And,
wow.
So it's just like real pieces of hearing things, but I did get a family line on, who was my grandfather? Was he a famous person? And I had heard this kind of narrative about he's somebody who did his job during the war. But I don't know about your
Dorothy?
Well, I like how you said family framing of it, because really my primary recollection is also of school children telling me a way of looking at it that I'm not sure whether I agree with it, but the first thing that I really remember is being maybe 4th grade, and I remember announcing my name, and at the time I may have been referring still to, he invented the atomic bomb, because that was a very common way of referring to it, and I think at some point my dad corrected that and explained the intricacies of it, and of course I know more now. At any rate, the school boy, he looked at me and he said, "So it's your fault."
Whoa.
And I just remember that and having this feeling of protest and shame, all this conflict at the same time. And of course this reveals a lot about me and how I listened to what somebody else had to say and began to realize that there was a lot to this story. But my understanding of my family name and place has really evolved over time, and as I've grown into my 40s, I'm getting interested now. I've spent a lot of my life distance from it.
Yeah, it wasn't your story. It was.
Well, it wasn't, and it was. I mean, when I changed my name when I got married, and I did that consciously because I wanted to do things on my own. I had a lot of motivations. I was also a lot younger. And it's really interesting being here today. I see the reception Charlie gets with his tag that says Oppenheimer. And it's just so funny how people can see the name and just associate it with so much, and they see the family name as part of the person, of Robert Oppenheimer.
Well, Oppenheimer today is, particularly with this crowd, he is a legend, a hero. But of course, in 1954, he went through a terrible national sort of exercise of humiliation and this witchcraft kind of trial. And I know from talking to Peter, your father, that was a traumatic experience, not only for Oppie, but for your father, who was then very young. What Peter was then, in high school? 13, 14, So as growing up, when did Peter talk to you about the trial?
So
did he sit you down and explain this ever?
And I'm not sure that my dad would agree that it was, a terrible or a big deal. The family narrative is that it was a, farce and not a tragedy.
Oh, okay.
And it wasn't a big deal. Now, that's
it was a farce.
Yeah, but that's what I've heard about it. Not that our family suffered an injustice and this is a big deal. Barely ever heard about that side of it. And if I asked my father directly, who had a direct line to it, he'd say, it was no big deal. He told me one story of I think. Well, he must have been younger than that. He told me that he might have been in 5th or 6th grade, and he wrote something on the chalkboard of saying, some people are treating other people unfairly,
right.
And that was like a sense of protest, and there was definitely an effect. But
yeah, I remember I have that anecdote in American Prometheus.
And I was curious where you got that. Okay.
I think from my dad, because I'm pretty sure I've heard that from him as well, not just your book, but it wasn't something that was discussed a lot. As you can tell with our family, the whole topic was not dwelled on or focused. We had no part of our life except for the public stuff that we just had to deal with people, especially in New Mexico where it is more prevalent, going on field trips to Los Alamos. But there wasn't a big part of our family life that was saying, you're an Oppenheimer, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, I became pretty curious in it, and my father was really open to talking about it, and he would spend any amount of time talking to us. So almost all the discussions were kind of one-on-one, discussions that evolved out of kids asking questions, and I learned a lot of our positioning based on that, but it might have been...
Yeah, I have a different experience, and I'm the older sibling, and I, not by that much, but I didn't ask many questions, and now I'm beginning to see that it would be valuable to ask him questions directly. He would not, I just spoke to him recently about the idea of it being a traumatic thing, because in growing up with your phone's wiretapped, being hunted by the FBI, I mean, just all, and I put myself, I imagine being in that position and how awful it would be. And so I asked my dad, and he said, no, my parents really protected me. Really, that it wasn't some awful thing for us. That's what he says. So I wasn't there. I don't know. I wouldn't enjoy it. So I didn't really ask him questions maybe the same way. Charlie has his own relationship with my dad, and I have mine.
Sure.
And I didn't ask a whole lot of questions, and I'm beginning to get more curious now.
I really like the treatment in your book, American Prometheus, especially after that post-war period, because I learned more from that section of the whole situation. You know, in my first years of becoming really interested, I mostly experienced the topic like most people would be interested in Oppenheimer. When you get some books, you read about it, but I always had the backdrop of, well, what does my dad think, and what does the family think? And I always asked him all the time. And he has very strong beliefs, really passed to him from his father, that are so hard to deal with. I think actually that's where it comes from. Like what my grandfather thought was right around nuclear energy and proliferation, and the right, just ethics and moral in society are these, kind of elaborate customs that don't really fit in. And so my dad always had these ideas about what was right and wrong. For example, he can't stand almost anything published about the family. He thinks it's deeply inaccurate if there's, a statement or two is off, and that applies to almost everything that's published about our family. And he's probably right. I have a much more tolerant view of it. I'm like, oh, they were wrong about a few things, but it's an interesting read. So it really does matter who you are when you're dealing with fame and legacy. Are you directly affected by it? I think the sons of famous, powerful men probably have the worst job in the world. That's famous across history, right? You have a powerful king and the son's a disaster. As a grandchild, we have to deal with our legacy like everybody does, but it certainly hasn't been overwhelming. There's been many times where I thought, gee, I wish I could have gotten something out of being an Oppenheimer. Yeah. I felt like I've never received a red nickel out of it. It's just something that sometimes comes up, and
well, the first thing anybody asks us is whether we're physicists.
So you get high expectations from teachers. The New Mexican term would be like, what I would get is, you invented the atomic bomb. And I'm like, wait a second here.
Right.
We don't have a lot of time to discuss on the schoolyard. That's off by a few magnitudes.
Right.
Oh dear, that does sound difficult and not traumatic, but weird. It's just
weird might be a good way to describe it.
Like just a weird childhood.
I have another memory of like sitting in Fat Man and Little Boy, if you remember the Hollywood movie, and that made a pretty big stir. It's a Hollywood movie where kids in New Mexico, where the Manhattan Project is a bigger deal than most places, and I was already kind of developing an interest in this instead of just being like creeped out by being an Oppenheimer. So I wanted to go to the movie, and of course nobody would go with me. My dad's like, no way. He wouldn't even consider doing something like that. So I was sitting there in the movie theater. I was old enough to go on my own. And I remember just sitting next to people watching this and saying, yeah, that's my grandfather, that's my grandmother, eating some popcorn. Nobody knows that. You're just watching the movie. And there's been a series of things like that through my life. Now, I'm by far more open and dealing with it than ever before. I never really had a problem with it, but now at least I have some opportunity to show up and say, I'm an Oppenheimer. Like most of the jobs I take, the people I meet, they don't even know that. It doesn't come up, and I was taught not to go around and say, hey, I'm an Oppenheimer, and now I'm willing to at least say it if the circumstances are right.
Well, and you guys are old enough now to realize, as you mentioned, that, all history, what you read it's very subjective, and all books are filled with errors, if not, errors of judgment, and also of fact. And so you have to, take it all with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
But
that's right.
There's something jarring still about seeing a photo of my grandfather. I mean, anywhere around here today. I mean, but I'm getting more used to it. But it is kind of, and I show my children and say, look, that's your great grandfather.
Remember Dr. Atomic, the love
Yes,
scene, and you're like, oh, that's my grandmother.
Very
Love scene on
yeah,
the
it's
bed.
very uncomfortable. I didn't like that.
Me and Dorothy were both there.
That's awkward.
That's grandma.
I've never seen that opera.
Yes, we went to see it, and it was an experience. Yeah.
Yeah, that's-
So speaking of that, have you seen, over the years, like The Day After Trinity,
Yeah.
the documentary? And
So there's a few approved vehicles by the Oppenheimer family, which I feel is my dad, because he knew Robert, and he's extremely selective on what he likes and he doesn't like. And the approved ones are the Day After Trinity, which he liked a lot, and it's the Letters and Recollections of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which are the first-hand accounts. He always says, if you want to know about it, read that, and he's right. You read it from the people. And Richard Rhodes' books. Those are the only ones I've ever heard about that he actually likes, and he likes. Those are always kind of started to be, what we look at. But it's one of those weird things. Robert Oppenheimer, of all people, I mean, he has this cult of personality that's so hard to figure out for historians and anybody. It's this fascinating story, and then when you meet an actual Oppenheimer, you're like, wow, they're not that great. It's like, it makes it even more bizarre than if it was just like some famous guy. In particular, people having a hard time pinning down who this guy was, I guess has made it difficult to deal with for the families, for some people. Not for me.
So, coming back to your childhood, you both spent part of your, as I understand it, your early childhood in the old ranch up there. What's it called?
Perro Caliente in
Yes.
Pecos.
Yeah, but
Pecos.
nobody in the family called it that. To
They
be
just called
clear,
it
that's some byline.
The
We
Perro
called it the
Caliente.
ranch.
You called
Yeah,
it
we
the
all
ranch.
called it.
So did Robert, as far as I know, because I don't
Did
think
Peter call it the ranch?
Yeah,
He
everybody
never
just-
called it.
No, I think
hot
that was
dog.
something that happened and got written down, but I don't think anybody in the family did.
The ranch.
Yeah, that's what we call it.
Well, when I was researching the book, at one point I was out there and I actually rented a horse from, what's it called?
Probably Huey Lay down in Totoro.
Lays down in Torero.
It's the only place you can rent
It
a
really,
horse.
that's where it was.
We took horses up to
Yes.
the ranch. And
Yeah, we have the photo in the book.
there's a photo in the book of Marty and I standing on the front porch, I guess. It's a beautiful but stark piece of geography. What are your memories of what it was like living there?
So that, I'll let Dorothy handle this, but that much more than Robert Oppenheimer was our bearing in life.
Yeah.
Being raised in a log cabin in the ranch is who we were, not
It just happened that it was where your grandfather had spent a lot of time and he loved it.
I will ponder this probably my whole life, whether it is just happened or if it was something that was a reaction or a distancing on my dad's part. All I know is he really wanted to live there and was able to convince my mom to go live there with me as a very young child. Charlie is a young child. Our sister came later.
Sister Ella Oppenheimer.
Did
Yeah,
Ella
sister.
live there ever?
No.
Did
Did she live there when
I guess,
we were in? She's 6
right,
years
I
younger
mean,
than
maybe
me.
as a really young infant, right after she was born, we had been living on the ranch full time. And this is in a log cabin with no electricity.
Right.
My mom cooked on a wood stove. We had an outhouse. And that's how we lived, and that's what defined us. We lived within 20 miles from the nearest household, and it was not that unusual to live that way in the 1890s or 1910 or 1920.
Or 19.
In 1975 in New Mexico, it wasn't that unusual to go back to the land, but we were really back to the land. We have some friends, really good friends in northern New Mexico who would be considered hippies. They were part of the hippie movement. And they said, well, you're the only people we knew who were weirder than, more off the map than us. Right. They lived in a village.
Well, they still are. They still live in a
the
fabulous
Deakleys,
life.
we love them. But yeah, we lived completely off the map, and But it wasn't, yeah.
You know, the thing is, I grew up with reading, I grew up without television, I mean, of course, this is a different era, and it's so different from how my children are coming up now, just so different. I'm happy, absolutely, that my dad and essentially my grandfather gave me that opportunity, because that's the reason I was able to grow up in this cabin. It gave me an appreciation for really kind of self-sufficiency and self-reliance, and I absolutely trusted my dad in all areas to take care of us. When we would be driving through really deep snow, getting stuck, he could get us out of any kind of jam. I learned a lot about how to live on land and in nature, and I absolutely appreciate that, and I think that is something passed down through my family, from Robert Oppenheimer through to my dad, to me, and in my case, it may be ending with me.
Me too, I'm not too handy.
So,
What's happened to the ranch? Is it still in the family?
It's still there, and it's, you know, like the land is in good shape, and my dad's maintained it. The cabin is like essentially falling down,
yes.
and talk about legacies. That's something that just kind of weighs on my father. Like apparently he had made a deal with his dad when they were going to sell it in the 50s or 60s. This is like a teenage or a young man's deal, saying, "Don't sell it, Dad. I'm going to take care of it." And it's to some extent hung around his neck for his life. He did do that. He raised a family and brought his family there, but it's been something that like. That's a real sense of visible, like, weird family emotions around the ranch, and it's so much, it's not a vacation cabin that it started as. It started as a way to get healthy for Robert, and it really worked. You know, Robert and Frank spending all their time being great horsemen, causing Los Alamos to be centered in New Mexico was that from that place. But when we experienced it, was just a family thing, you know, living.
Remind me, how many acres is it around?
It's about 160, so it's a quarter-acre homestead. And my dad has a great, actually, a vision for it. At one point, you know, 10, 15 years ago, I said, "Dad, let's get electricity in there and get it to be a really nice vacation cabin, and I'll go there and work out of it." And he said, you know, he would entertain me with letting me say that. But then he would say, you know, I think it's the only place that up in the Cowles Pecos cabin that actually hasn't been converted into a vacation cabin. It's the only one that's, you know, true to its historical roots as a hand-hewn log cabin from the 1890s. He's really interested in the specific history of the geography of that cabin. He knows everything about every cabin that was built in the valley, you know, not because of Robert Oppenheimer, but because he thinks it's really interesting, you know. That's so I'd love to like get it back in shape, because the cabin's like teetering, it's almost in pristine historical shape, and it's almost falling down, you know. That's exactly where it's at. You know, structurally it's fine, but it would need to be completely rehabbed at this point.
Yeah, when I saw it, structurally it seemed pretty solid.
Yeah, but structurally it's okay, but it would need like at least a construction project.
But every winter it must go under more stress.
Right, and it's not.
And it won't be rehabbed with like a typical industrial effort. At least when my dad's there, it's going to be hammer and nail and not a single, you know, piece of electrical anything.
So when you were growing up, did you grow food there? Was it
a little bit?
Was there cattle?
We had goats.
Goats?
No, it wasn't. We didn't have it as a working ranch, but we did have goats.
Yeah, and there was really just enough food to go around the edges. It was more just rural living where we would.
And was there running water from the spring in your house?
Yeah, there were. Yes, it's really quite dried up now, owing to the drought. But
it was water for drinking into the house, but then an outhouse, and I think we took baths in wash tubs.
There were no toilets and no showers.
And your mother cooked over a wood stove.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cast iron.
And did you have horses like Robert did?
Yeah.
You had horses.
Yeah.
So you rode. You were good.
You know,
riders.
I wasn't a horseman. I know, you know, Robert and Frank were really good horsemen. Robert in particular. My dad was very good. He was a rancher primarily, a little bit of a construction. As a kid, I could barely saddle a horse. I could definitely ride them, but I never really got my ranch.
Yeah, I never saddled a horse much myself, but I feel really comfortable riding them.
We ended up moving to Santa Fe, you know, and becoming city people, and that was always the demarcation in the family. It was like, well, we used to live up in the ranch and the mountains doing this cool stuff, and now we live in the city, and everything's different now.
So how old were you, Charlie, when you moved from the ranch to Santa Fe?
There was 2 periods, so I must have moved there when I was 4 or 5, living my entire life up there, and then we went back when I was 7 or 8. So I think most of my memories are from that second period, but those were the only 2 periods.
So when you were 7 or 8, you moved back there, and
Yeah.
you stayed how long?
It was probably only a summer and a winter.
It was like half a school year.
Well, yeah, so 6 months, and that's where like the majority of probably my older memories are from. Definitely some of my younger ones, but.
And Dorothy, you spent longer then.
Well, yes, because I'm older, and I always say that I went to Santa Fe when I was about 6, and I started first grade, and then that I was 9 and did half of 4th grade up at Pecos Elementary, and.
So it was a rough school. We were probably like the only white kids in the school.
Yeah.
You know?
I
didn't realize that
I had a great
till many
time,
years,
but
yeah.
he didn't have a very good time there.
Yeah.
So
at least partially, we went back to Santa Fe because the schools were better, and I think it was pretty hard to live off the land also for the family.
So you're pretty close to Los Alamos.
Mm-hmm.
Did Peter take you to Los Alamos and visit it ever, or?
We had no official relationship at all.
Yeah.
We went ice skating there.
Oh, that was fun.
I met some of the directors over the years. My main memories of Los Alamos, besides like field trips and stuff, were once my dad started participating more in like kind of anti-nuclear movement, and he would go there to talk or do some action. That was for just a brief few years, but that's when I remember going to Los Alamos, is protesting the place, you know. So
Filled with some irony.
yeah.
Well, I have no memory of that. I remember going on peace marches with my dad to Nevada. Apparently we were here, and I remember a lot of things about here, but I don't remember the peace march part of it. I remember going to Nambe a lot to visit the Hempelmans, Eleanor and Louis Hempelman. I spent a lot of time visiting them.
The Hempelmans.
So
right.
Dr. Hempelman was on the project, but I think one of the main reasons we're so close is it was really Eleanor and Kitty were good friends as the women, although Dr. Hempelman was, you know, a big part as a physician of the project, but it was really more as a family friend.
Yeah, he was a medical doctor.
He was a medical doctor during the war, but that was a family relationship that's always gone on. My dad's, like when we were kids, when we were, you know, transitioning to these different places of Indian reservations and the ranch, we would stay in the Hempelman's house, and so it's a family connection that's always been there.
So did your dad keep in touch with any other Los Alamos veterans over the years besides the Hempelmans?
There was certain scientists who would come by. I remember, I think Philip Stern.
Philip Stern was he was a lawyer here in Washington, D.C., and a author of, he did a book about the trial, the 1954 trial.
Maybe I have the wrong name. Oops,
think
edit that part out.
I'll remember it in time. I know what you're
There's a
saying.
few.
So, but that he may well have come out.
He may have, but the guy I'm remembering is more of a scientist. You know, so there were certain scientists who kept.
Philip Morrison.
Philip Morrison.
Yeah.
There we
I got
go.
the first name right. Philip Morrison. I remember
he
him
was
in
very
our
close.
house.
I remember that too.
I remember Frank. Frank Oppenheimer
Yeah,
would visit us, and both at the ranch and at our house, and so there was. You know, the same type of connection that you would have with any of your parents' friends. Oh, there's Frank Oppenheimer, you know, he's our family. But so it was that kind of thing. But my father certainly didn't. I think he was always more comfortable with the generation of World War II, but that's just because he socially doesn't. So people like the Hempelmans, he kept in touch and would go and spend Thanksgiving with her every year. And, you know, Francois Houlon, we kept in touch with because she was really old, and my dad is a 60-year-old.
And she moved to a place there, and we would go visit her in her place.
But it was just light things like that. There was never, you know, my dad growing up didn't grow up with a sense of like, I've got to preserve our legacy and keep in touch with X, Y, and Z people. Absolutely the opposite. It just was people that he felt on a personal level, some connection, or for some reason they knew us.
So Philip Morrison was someone that you remember coming to
our
visit.
house.
He was very close to Oppie, and I think he, had a relationship with your father too, just supportive. And,
a few other veterans coming through, but I don't remember all their names.
I remember the same.
So, tell me a little more about Frank Oppenheimer. Do you have memories of him? What he was like, or?
I do.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, what I remember about him was I remember walking along Galisteo Street in Santa Fe with my dad and him, and just having a conversation. And so what I remember of him is just, I felt affectionate toward him, and he seemed so comfortable just walking along the dirt street. The road was paved, but there were no actual sidewalks. And I remember my dad, who was giving me a little bit of a hard time about something, and Frank said to him, "Don't be so hard on her." And so I always felt like he was my hero because he kind of protected me, So I remember visiting them for.
Now, this is in the 70s, or?
That would have been the 80s.
No, that's when that was the 80s. He was,
By that time, he was living in San Francisco.
But he would come through.
He was no longer in Colorado on his ranch.
That ended a long time ago.
Yeah.
I remember our first visits out to San Francisco as a 3-year-old, it must have been, but those are some of my first. I remember a ferry boat ride and somewhat of Frank's house. I also remember when he visited us at the ranch one time, and I guess it was one of the times we were living there, but he drank out of the spring with his hat, and that just shocked me.
Wow,
yeah. Who drinks out of the spring of their hat? I know everybody does a push-up and drinks out of it on the ground, So I found that really shocking. And then we've been in pretty close touch with his daughter, Judy.
Oh, yeah.
Oppenheimer, who lives in the Bay Area, so me and Karen, always visit. And then there's the Exploratorium, which is an absolute institution in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. Everybody knows about it, but hardly anybody knows the name Frank Oppenheimer, and they don't realize
I'm
that
surprised by
that.
that.
And the people who work there certainly know about it, but that's not what anybody out of hundreds or millions of people, if you say the name Exploratorium, almost none of them would be able to say, oh, Frank Oppenheimer started it. So, for example, living in San Francisco, that's not a bonus. Nobody knows about that. It's just another part of the family. And the Exploratorium, which is an amazing institution, has zero affiliation with the Oppenheimer family. And I think there was a period of time where there was a little bit of hard feelings, with the kids, where they weren't including them in the funeral. I had less so, just not an affiliation. But it's a lovely institution. And I came to learn 100% Frank. I mean, that place was Frank's teaching style turned into a museum.
Exactly.
It's not like partially created by Frank, but that was
his thing.
Original.
He really invented the interactive
science
museum.
I remember enjoying it as a young child.
Yeah, that's
right. There very much.
So I'm thinking of other family members. Kitty died in 1972. Is that right, or 73?
I'm not sure because my mom met her. So
Anyway,
it must have been around there.
You never met Kitty, yeah. So are there any stories about Kitty that you remember being told as you were growing up by Peter, or?
We were told nothing about Kitty, so my dad won't discuss it.
I will tell you that my dad absolutely says nothing bad about his parents.
Never, yeah.
Absolutely
Not a word. And I don't think
not
it's...
one negative word.
And it's not like they were terrible people, I'm not going to tell you, but he says either good things or, he doesn't have, he doesn't agree with this perception that they were some terrible family. And, my dad's an eccentric person, I don't mind saying on camera, doesn't relate perfectly with the world, and he definitely says that's the kind of person he is. He's the kind of person who ends up in... He's a very
private person.
Yeah, he ended up in New Mexico in the 70s. He's not, there's people like that. And so there's the fame thing and that's who he is. And I think some of the characterizations of the Oppenheimer family is, they were bad parents and that's caused these problems. I don't think it's accurate. We have an extremely close family, and that was passed down from my dad through just closeness and great interactions.
I'm a culprit then, probably having
as a historian or an author, you don't know. People don't know. You can never, there's never any one story. I'm sure there's things that my dad went through.
I'm reporting what other people said, but of course, this is even the closest of family friends can't sometimes know a family.
That's
so
right. Sometimes I describe to people, I say, do a thought experiment with me. What if somebody wrote a book about your mom? and they got every fact right. They wrote it down. They said, this is when she went to high school, and here's what her personality was like, and this is, you know, an analysis of her personality, and published that book. You're not going to agree with that. You're going to say that's a pile of garbage. You're going to have a really hard time of believing somebody else's interpretation,
Right.
and analyzing somebody, especially if you didn't meet them. And I think, 'cause
Well,
my dad
okay,
is a
then this
sensitive
is
person.
important. Let's get this on the record. Growing up, you never got the sense from Peter that he had any feelings of animosity towards Kitty or his
No.
father.
Never.
No,
Not
and
one time.
it's pretty much, I've heard many people talk about their parents and complain about them, all of us included. You know, and my dad had positive things to say about his family, that, you know, that his dad,
Yes.
now Kitty, he just has less to say, you know, so I've asked him sometimes to say, tell me this and tell me that, and he won't talk about it a lot, but it's certainly not a series of complaints about this and that. Yeah.
When I read your narrative in American Prometheus, it really piqued my interest in learning more about my grandmother as a person and all of her complications. I think I might see the potential for a bigger picture and see her as a more full person than the neural portrayal as an evil person or something awful like this. I
hope
didn't enjoy
I
it.
didn't
It was a quote.
portray
Somebody else said.
portray her
Somebody else
as an
said.
evil person.
Jackie, there was a quote in there from Jackie saying that.
Oh,
Jackie didn't
like
like her though.
Jackie
They
yeah,
didn't
right.
like it
So
a
there
lot.
was a lot in there. I mean, that's not really the purpose of this interview. We can talk about it at a different time, what I thought of your book. But the point is, it piqued my interest in, how would I portray somebody I hadn't met but that's related to me? And I really piqued my curiosity in her. I started to think I wanted to know more about her as a person. So that's something good, but I don't have anything additional
I
to
do
add.
have something that my dad would be horrified for me to say,
Then
but
maybe
since
you
I'm on
would.
camera, because it's not his comment, so something my mom has,
Yeah, our mom
has told
you
me
didn't ask
over
about
the
that.
years is, so my mom read and wrote German, and she said that she read letters written by Kitty about Peter that were damning, saying that, terrible things about a baby or that couldn't be true. Now my mom, I haven't read those letters and I don't know how accurate she is, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if there was a terrible relationship between the mom and the child. I have not heard that, and that's not the way. The family itself, my dad has, I can't imagine, I've heard good things and I came from a good family, a close, good family that could really talk to each other and take care of each other, and I don't think that came from, out of the blue.
But these letters were in German from Kitty.
Kitty to somebody else.
Yeah,
describing-
she could write in German.
Yeah.
And, she came from German ancestry and she had relatives in Europe and so, yeah. Well.
That's if we could find them, maybe they'd have more historical merit. But my father's never said anything about her. I'd like to hear more, but you can only get what you can get.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Well, obviously Kitty was a very colorful, dynamic, vibrant, assertive woman.
Yeah. By the way,
and
some of the research you guys published shocked me. We never had heard anything about her, and so when you said that she was related to this royal family and, famous Nazis, I had no idea. I was like, that's one of the advantages of being related to a famous family. You have people doing research for you, and you get to read these things. And I was kind of impressed by that. I didn't know we had some, German, very distantly
I think
German
that's
royal
true. That's all true.
bloodlines, and
One thing I would like to say, though, on the subject of Kitty is, we read things differently over time. And there's a way maybe to read her. I hear she's a colorful, outspoken person, and she is a generation when women weren't necessarily outspoken and colorful.
Yeah.
That was probably offensive to somebody who wasn't an
Exactly.
innate feminist.
she was an early feminist in a
So
way.
I respect that. I also, we may not look at the disease model of maybe perhaps, alcoholism, something like that. There's things such as postpartum depression. There's a lot of different ways that we might read a person now that are more complicated. I think we allow for that now. And it made me interested to see what I could discover. So
Yeah, absolutely.
start that process.
Wow, no, these very complicated stories and complicated people, and just tell. I want to assure you, as the biographer, I don't have any confidence that what I've written is the end of the story. There'll be, other biographers will come along and with new evidence, and maybe these new letters or.
Well, that's kind of a funny thing about Robert Oppenheimer's life in general. I guess you could have a more examined life, but I'm not sure how. Like, every hour of everything that he ever did has been interpreted and examined. And I can't think of another example. I read about presidents, but I haven't seen like a team of investigative historians going over every nuance of literally, it's down to the hour of most of his life. And I'm like, it's kind of a bizarre thing, that there's that much attention on it.
Well, yeah, no, it is. It is bizarre. It's happened because of the FBI records, in part, 8,000 pages of all this surveillance. Yeah. It's happened because he has become such a, iconic figure in history. Yeah. And
if Richard Rhodes' interpretation from this morning is, if part of, like you said, if he's partially right about that, the end of war. Right. It is a big deal, and people would be talking about these people who did this project hundreds of years from now, and in that case, the historical effort done now would pay off. But in human and family terms, it's like so overwhelming that usually you just wouldn't even pay attention to it. That's certainly what my dad does with the published stuff. He doesn't want to see that version because he has a memory of people he knows. And so that was some of our earlier memories when they'd have shows on TV. He wouldn't prohibit us from watching it, although we didn't watch a lot of TV in general. But he didn't want to watch it because he felt like he'd be just picking up somebody else's interpretation of people he knew.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I understand that sentiment.
So did he ever take you back to Princeton and show you his family home?
Yes.
One time.
Yes, we were talking about that the other day, and I kind of say maybe I was 12?
I know I was in 4th grade, so.
Okay, so I would have been.
Yeah, about 12.
Yeah, 11 or 12, because it was the fall, so I probably would have just turned 12. Yeah, we took a very nice trip out here, and we did see the house that he grew up in. I remember being in it. It was nice. It matches the pictures.
Yeah, the reason we went was during a peace march, an anti-nuke rally that ended in Washington, D.C. So we went to New York, and we were just kids. We went along as tourists, saw that, we participated in that, and then stopped in New Jersey and visited Olden Manor. And it was very impressive to me, it's this giant mansion. I was like, wow, that's not how I grew up,
And they gave you a tour inside, the current director.
And my dad would show us where, they added the pool and memories he had. Talked about Einstein coming over one time and the dog scaring him. I think when we were at that house, I'm not sure, I thought they were German Shepherds. But just, it was nice. And then we went to the Institute. And some other places in New Jersey, but it was almost just a coincidence that we dropped in there and ended up in DC for the end of the Peace March.
And I have no recollection of the Peace March.
That was the last time you were here in Washington, D.C.
I remember leaves, I remember Olden Manor, I remember steam coming out of the grates in New York City alleyways. I remember the train, but I had no recollection of the Peace March at all.
So is it which peace march could this have been?
I'm sure we could look it up, but there
was
a
an anti-nuke.
There was a big anti-nuke movement in the
1980.
This might have been 85, 86.
And we would also go to Nevada. Sometimes my dad would take us there, and I remember that. But
so for a brief period, my father became more interested in that movement, and while he's really kind of like anti-participating in Oppenheimer events, he had encouraged me, saying, well, if you're going to use your last name, you can use it for something like that. And so as I'm speaking here today, I had this virulent anti-nuclear speech, and I was like, I better cross that out. And so now I have a few little anecdotes I'm going to share, hopefully in 5 minutes when I go and talk to the audience.
Well, have you ever heard your grandfather's speech that's on tape that he gave 3 months after Hiroshima?
I haven't heard it, but I've read it. That's the one in Los Alamos, right? Is it October?
No, that's a different one.
Okay.
It's very close in time, and he may have said something very similar. People talk about that speech a lot, but he also gave a speech in Philadelphia to the American Philosophical Society, and it's now online.
Okay.
YouTube, and Marty and I quote from it in American Prometheus. And it's, he had this very soft-spoken, haunting voice.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he, at one point he says something like, well, if you think that this Manhattan Project was an expensive thing because you've read in the paper that it cost $2 billion, you would be wrong. It was actually very cheap.
Yeah.
And there are no secrets. And this weapon is a weapon for aggressors. It can only be used on cities. And this weapon was used on an essentially already defeated enemy. And and then in the beginning of the speech, he talks about science and how this was inevitable to discover this. He's not
the great things of
he's not
science
taking back what he did.
Yeah,
He said
yeah.
we had to find out how the atom worked and everything. And he's also buying into sort of Richard Rhodes's argument about we needed to do this to try to end all wars. That was an idea he got from Bohr. And but he's clearly becoming an anti-nuclear activist in a way.
Yeah, I mean, he said it in Los Alamos, I think, in
Yeah.
October, right while he was at Los Alamos, that if the weapons that we made here are going to be added to the arsenals of mankind, the day will come that we curse the name of Los Alamos, or something like that.
Yeah, that's very close.
And so, he both was very clear. I mean, these scientists were geniuses. He
Yes.
wasn't the only one. They saw what was going to happen, and he said, the way we're headed, we're going to get into an arms race, and we shouldn't do it. And not only was he willing to speak out, not on the, marching on Washington that nobody listens to, but just say exactly what he thought about them, but also work on the inside of the government to try to control them with his position of power instead of, some of the other scientists who were probably more ideologically rigid would want to protest it and say, but he tried to use his power to work on the inside to control them, and the plans they set forth were pragmatic. International control of fissionable materials with the Acheson-Lilienthal suggestion in 46 and 47 was the plan that George Bush was implementing in 2007, saying, hey, if we can control fissionable materials, we can control this. So, I mean, they laid out the plan to not get into an arms race, to use cooperative control of atomic energy, the times were against my grandfather. I guess it's debatable about whether, I think my dad's opinion is he was lucky to get crucified by the institution, because they were a bunch of buffoons and warmongers. They were never going to listen to him, and it essentially set him free, and he did his duty. He did try very hard to get them to control and work on it. But it wasn't ambiguous where he was coming from. He didn't apologize for his work during the war, like no soldier apologized for it either. He did what he had to do, and he knew what should be done afterwards, and he tried really hard to get it done. So, I can't fault him for any of those. That's the family position. My dad is a true pacifist, an innate, sensitive, true pacifist. My grandfather was not. He's much more pragmatic, maybe a little bit like me. But my dad truly doesn't believe in war, and so I think he belonged in a march against it rather than be inside of the government like Robert Oppenheimer.
Yeah, I see my grandfather as very brave and honest, and my dad has always been very clear that he was loyal and patriotic, and in the genuine sense, and that's familiar information for everyone. But I really do believe that he loved the country and loved what he was doing, and
Yeah,
recognized
nobody-
the effects.
Well, one of the harder things to deal with, like most of my upbringing of saying, hey, you invented the atomic bomb, wasn't particularly hard for me. I'm like, oh, at least I got a little bit of attention. One of the times that it was a little bit hard was an Oppenheimer conference that I went to in Berkeley in 2004, right before I got married. And a reporter walked up to me and said, that was when Greg Herkin published his book, which had what I felt was salacious details about some, impossible conspiracy. There was a secret member of the Communist Party that nobody could have known about except him. So I'm like, how do you prove that? I hadn't read too much into it. And a reporter asked me, was your grandfather a communist? And I said, well, let's not name names. Why does it matter if he was a communist or not? And that was in the newspaper, and I read that, and I'm like, no, he wasn't a communist. Everybody knows he wasn't a communist, but I didn't come out and spit that out to the reporter. I mean, he's provably not a communist. The FBI knew he wasn't. And so some of that kind of attention during that conference was hard. I emotionally felt it. I'm like, why are these guys talking about my grandfather that way after what he did for the country? But after I've researched it a lot more, I have a little more, it doesn't bother me as much. Personally, that trial in the 50s is in some sense comical when I think about the kind of senators we elect now. Those are the guys who were accusing my grandfather, and their accusation, when you read it, was that he was insufficiently sufficient to run a crash program to develop a hydrogen bomb. And what kind of accusation is that? He was insufficiently enthusiastic, but in the 50s, that was a black mark, and it was so effective, the way you guys outlined it, because his place in society and his aura of this incredible person, which really all the scientists and a lot of people believed was so tenuous that the minute you pricked that and said, wait, there's some doubt here, is this really a good guy? It was just, that was all it took to deflate the entire card of like, Oppenheimer is the in that sense, I guess it could be tragic. But.
He was one of the chief victims of this McCarthyite witch hunt that we went through, and that we still live with the residue of it in American political culture. It's
the same genre that would, it's the same political thinking. You can trace exactly where it went from there to today.
Well, personally, what I find in my legacy, in our legacy, is the idea that that kind of thing could happen again. And that is what frightens me, or when I want to sort of shy away from the Oppenheimer legacy, because I have this sense of how would I handle it if I did something fantastic and then I was attacked by my own government, and so there's this sense of vulnerability, and that may be why my dad sort of keeps to himself, and why I've kind of adopted that, keeping to myself. You didn't get that.
But I also feel more aggressive about it. Like some people probably, I think Oppenheimer was correctly characterized as somebody who couldn't stand up on trial well. And I see some of that in myself. If somebody said, did you do this? Are you guilty? I'm like, yeah, I'm probably guilty, but let's talk about it, And so I can see how even though I didn't do it. So I don't know if we're out of time here.
We're I guess running out of time, but let's end on what are there any? Well, two questions. Are there any sources that you think have not been yet tapped about the Oppenheimer family legacy, either in terms of letters, photographs? Is the family taking every precaution to preserve whatever is left? Are there things out there that historians haven't seen yet?
Perhaps.
I'm not totally sure. There probably is some things. My dad would be a good source of first-person information about this, and probably a good source to most of the documents. But he doesn't want to participate in that the vast majority of the time.